are so thankful for survivors like Fagi who are here with us and who've come to share from their eyewitness testimony what they went through and endured. We also thank the church, the venue, Pastor Tech, and the congregation, and our guests, honored guests who are here today, including the Habers. Thank you so much for joining us. This is a very special church congregation. It's been about, yes, indeed. And I was invited to join the committee and to be a liaison 10 years ago, and this church was the first church with which we hosted Holocaust Education Week together. So this church is very special, and also special to the survivors. I need to share with you what Fagi Libman said. I was sitting next to her, and she said, you know, she's here and there, 5 events for Holocaust Education Week, and this past week she was up in North Bay speaking as well for a separate event to the OPP police. Thousands gathered there. And you know what? With all of this hustle and bustle, and she's feeling tired and missing her son's 50th birthday celebration tonight, and seeing the children and the dancers and hearing the music, she said it was all worth it. Tonight, it made it all worth it. So a big thank you to all those who made this happen, and to the sound and tech team back there, amazing. And I've also been asked to introduce Fagi Libman for Holocaust Education Week. The theme of this year's Holocaust Education Week is Untold Stories, Illuminating the Shadows, Bringing Light to Darkness. And this is something that is very special. It holds a dear place in Fagi's heart. She is one of the extreme exceptions to have been a person, as a young person, to have survived both the Kovno ghetto in Lithuania and also Stutthof concentration camp. So she is a very special survivor. We are so grateful that you are here, Fagi. Very few. In fact, Lithuania had the highest per capita death toll of the Jewish population in Europe. And so to have a survivor from Lithuania is so special. There are only 3 who have spoken about their experience in the Toronto area from the Kovno ghetto, and yet Fagi can also share with us about what she had gone through as she was sent from concentration camp to labor camps and so on. And so we want to welcome you here, Fagi, and I thank you to all those who helped make her time here comfortable. As one final word, I would like to share that there is a means by which all of you may give feedback if you like, and there is a website. It's holocaustcenter.com. It's not hard to remember, holocaustcenter.com, and there you will find the Twitter feed, the Instagram, and any means by which you may give feedback to the Holocaust Center about your experience tonight. Thank you so much.
Will my story come on? It will come. This will come on? My story? Over there? But they won't see it.
No. It's
okay. Good. Good evening, everyone. I'm really honored to be here tonight. I wear a ribbon on my jacket. This is one of my speaking jackets. And it says, "Stand together against hate." I got this on the church on the hill in Toronto quite a while ago, because all the problems that happened this week And any time that happened so many years ago, it started with hate. Hate is a terrible word. I was for 26 years a junior kindergarten at Associated Hebrew School. In my class, we'd never use that word hate. We taught them to say, I don't like. It's a terrible word. And now I'm going to tell you my story. See, there's something new, clickers. As you can see, the story of Batya and Fega Schmidt. Now, as you know, you heard a lot about the war. I came to Canada with my mother. We were the only survivors. I would not speak. If my mother would say something, I used to say, Mother, the children, nobody wants to hear. And I'm going to tell you what made me start to speak, and now you cannot shut me up. I go from school to school. As you heard, it was very cold up north, at North Bay, with the OPP. I'm now an honorary member of the OPP. But it's very important to know what hatred did. Now I'm going to tell you why I began to tell my story. Can you imagine? The war finished in 1945. This is 1982. And as I told you, I was a junior kindergarten teacher for 26 years. 4- and 5-year-olds and 3-year-olds are absolutely delicious. I came home from school, and I opened up the Toronto Star, and it said, North York man was arrested by the RCMP while taking part of the massacre of 10,500 Jews in Kaunas, Lithuania. Can you imagine? And it said his name. His name was Helmut Rauka, and he was in charge of the Kaunas ghetto. I have to tell you, I called my supervisor, and I told her I don't think coming to school today, because I tried to hide. I tried to not to pretend it didn't happen. But I remembered him very well. And it's very ironic that to this day, he's the only Nazi that was ever arrested, sent to West Germany, and he died in jail. And he lived, if you know Toronto, there's a Newtonbrook High School. 2 streets away is on Tobby Street. That's where he lived for 40 years. I lived, after moving from Montreal, on Fontainebleau. So we were neighbors. And when he was arrested, the neighbor said, what do you want from him? He is such a nice man. He plays classical music. And now I'm going to tell you my story. As I said, I was born in Kaunas, Lithuania, a very cosmopolitan city. The Jewish people did very well there. They were very learned. There was a yeshiva. There was high schools. There was... And you can see, wasn't I adorable? That's me and my mother. My mother, when I was born, July 29th, 1934. My mother was already a surgical nurse. My father, right on the side, owned an international bookstore. My maiden name is Schmidt. I come from German descent, very high class. I had a very good life. I was an only child with a governess. We had a very good life in Kaunas. Here you can see my mother and I are dressed in matching dresses, visiting her family. She came. My mother was, you'll hear about my mother, she was something extraordinary. 5 foot, very short, but my kids labeled her the general. My mother was in charge. And maybe her will and God, God had a lot to do with it, that I'm standing here and speaking to you. And as I said, right over here, she was the youngest one. She had 5 sisters. One left way before the war to New Rochelle, New York. Her brother left to South Africa. A lot of Lithuanian Jews left for South Africa. And another sister that my mother sponsored gave her money to come to Montreal, all before the war. My mother also had two sisters that remained in the small town, and this is a picture when we were going to visit to show off how well we were doing from the big city to come to see my grandparents, my mother's parents in the small town. And over here, you can see on top it says Mokslo. Mokslo means books. My father owned an international bookstore on Laisvės alėja in a very prominent city in Kaunas. It's still standing there, I was told. And me with a book, I'm with an aunt. My father was the oldest one. He had one sister who left way before the war to study in Berlin. But she saw something was going on, so she moved to Paris. Another sister moved to Buenos Aires, and one sister, the youngest one, was a university student. She remained in Kaunas with us. So in Kaunas was my father's parents and my aunt and my mother and the father and me. And life went on, and we had a wonderful life. And I'm going to tell you something happened on my 5th birthday. On my 5th birthday, my aunt from New Rochelle sent me the most wonderful present. She sent me a Shirley Temple doll. I was the envy. And I will show you a picture of a Shirley Temple doll, better looking than Montana and even Barbie. So I was the queen. Everybody wanted to play with me. And as I said, life went on. The war started in '39, not in Lithuania. In Lithuania, Russia came in. And we were still doing very well. My mother finished Hebrew Russian Gymnasia. She was still a big shot in the hospital. My father, he got some partners in his store, but he still had a store. And the only thing I remember, 1940, when Russia came in, I was 6 years old. I remember strangers coming into Lithuania, into Kaunas. Who were those people? Those were Polish Jews, because they were already persecuted in 1939 and 1938. So, but I don't remember anything. I only remember strangers coming into our house, and I remember asking my father who they were. He was saying, friends. Later on, I found out that those were Polish Jews running away, crossing the border because Lithuania was bordering Poland to save themselves. And as I said, life was okay. We didn't know anything. I started grade 1. I loved to sing. I think I was born singing and had a lot of friends. June of 1941, our life turned upside down, and it was never the same. What happened? Germany invaded Lithuania, and immediately they had, you know what, can you imagine if they would have concentrated on medicine? Maybe cancer wouldn't have been around as it's now. Everything was done methodically. The Jews were singled out immediately. My maiden name, as I told you, is Schmidt. It's not a Jewish name, it's a German name. But I suppose those who knew that we were Jews told off. And all the Jews had to leave their homes and move into the ghetto. The Kaunas ghetto was formed. You couldn't take with, in a suitcase, what I took with. I was allowed to take with one thing. I took with my Shirley Temple doll. I remember I wrapped it in rags. It was my most prized possession. And my mother, my father's parents, and his sister moved into the ghetto. I have to tell you of my mother's family, of the 2 sisters, one has 5 sons that remained in the small towns. Later on, we found out that all the Jews of the small town were mostly killed. They were pushed into synagogues and they were burned. At that time, we didn't know if we were okay. We were sure they were okay too, but I've never seen them again. So in the ghetto, right away was formed naturally a little hospital, and my mother went to work in that hospital, and in fact, there is a survivor, his name is Eli Gotz, and his mother was also a nurse, and his mother remembered my mother. If you knew my mother, you remembered my mother. And life went on. We were surrounded by barbed wire. You had to wear a yellow Star of David. If you were caught without it, you could be shot. Younger people, if they had a job outside of the ghetto, that was wonderful. They got a little bit more food. There was nothing, there was no stores, there was nothing. And also, the Kaunas ghetto was very unique. You were not allowed to have even a book. Some other ghettos even they had a schooling or whatever. The Kaunas ghetto, you were caught with a book, you could be shot. Now, how do I remember this man that I showed you, Helmut Raucher Yemach Shemo? How I showed you a picture of him. He was in charge of the ghetto. And I remember he always looked very mean. And you were afraid of him. If you saw him, you hid. You ran away. And now I'm going to tell you how I came face to face with him and how he was in charge of the great action of the massacre of 10,500 Jews of my people. In the ghetto, as I told you, you got some rations, you didn't. You brought in certain things. You were hungry, but not as bad as later on. And I remember with my friends at night, I always had a lot of friends being an only child. We used to go when it was dark because people who were non-Jews, who lived in the ghetto had to move out. But they had a garden, so maybe they left some vegetables. So we used to go at night and see maybe we can find some potatoes or some cabbage that people had planted and had to leave. And also, I was born with one thing. To this day, sometimes it gets me into trouble. I'm a very big optimist. I keep on saying, God will help. I don't know, I was a little kid, and I used to walk around and say, don't worry, God will help. I don't know. And also, in my father's store, I learned how to read before of my friends. So we used to hide at night, and I used to say, and sing. I think I was born singing, and try to make people feel better. My mother was always busy. As I told you, they had an infirmary in the ghetto. She was always working. My father was my very best friend. I have to tell you, I was a little bit afraid of my mother. My mother gave orders. My father was my very best friend. And now I'm going to tell you how I met, how the great action. What was the great action? Orders came out that all the Jews who are still living in the ghetto, because some of them went out to work. If you had a work detail, you got some extra rations. That was a good thing. To meet on Democracy Square, and they're going to count how many people are still in the ghetto, because don't forget, people died, people got killed, and they will give us more food. And it was done so methodically that you didn't know what was happening. Who was my family? My grandparents, my father's parents, his sister, and my mother and me. And as you marched in this open field, you saw this man, this Nazi, standing on a mount with a whip, a dog, and white gloves. To this day, I do not own a pair of white gloves. And you didn't know what was happening, so everybody was marching towards him. And with his whip, he divided. My grandfather and my aunt to one side, my mother, my father, and me, and my grandmother to the other side. October 28th, 1941 was the great action. And this was the last time I saw my grandfather and my aunt. I don't remember that if I realized what was happening. I was a kid. But I am sure that everybody else knew that their fate was sealed. And as we were standing there, we saw this multitude march up the mountain, the Tsar building counter some forts. And you saw this multitude march up the mountains. And later on, we found out that all those that were sent to the left were machine gunned to their death. And it was very ironic. As I told you, he didn't like people who looked dirty. So at the end of the line came some very young boys. If they had a job, that was wonderful, but they were coming back into the ghetto. But they looked all very dirty because they worked for 3 or 4 days in factories. And one of them that saved themselves from all the other corpses told the story that they were all machine gunned to their death. And how do you go on? You want to live. The will to live is very great. I still had a mother and a father and a grandmother. We were still a unit. And I can stand for hours and tell you all the terrible things that I saw, the people that were very sick already that couldn't be helped against the walls of the ghetto. But I still believe in God. And I still believe that I am a miracle. And I'm going to tell you of a real miracle. What happened? We were in the ghetto. They needed people to build the aerodrome where planes are. And my mother, as being a nurse, was always taken. She always had a job. So one day, they took my father, naturally, men, and my mother went with the men every morning to work. One day, as we were in that small labor camp from the ghetto, in that labor camp, to go to the aerodrome to work, she was waking me and telling me that she has permission to take me to work. And I remember telling her that I'm very tired because in a labor camp, you had to rely on rations. There was nothing you can find, and there was no fields or no anything. And what were the rations? A piece of bread and something else. And some of us who were Jews who didn't want to eat things that were not kosher, that were not right, so you relied on only soup. Big kettles of soup. So if they dug on the bottom, you got some vegetables. And if they served you from the top, so you got only broth. So my first really being hungry was in that labor camp in the airport where the planes were being built. And I remember telling my mother, I'm so hungry and tired, but if you knew my mother, you listened. And I went in the trucks with the men that day to work. And when we got back that night, it was something very eerie. What happened when I was away with the men to work? Trucks came and collected all the children and all the old people. This was called the final solution. The final solution was children are the lifeblood of a nation, and old folks, the old, are useless. In that camp, I was the only child left. Miracles. I don't know. And in fact, there was another young lady, her name is Helen Yermas, and she will tell you, if you'll hear from her, her little brother was pulled out from her hands. And what do? How do you go on? I still had a mother and a father. I did not have my grandmother because she was taken away with the old people. I was in 2009 in Berlin in Wannsee, and I saw on the walls orders. The final solution were the children and the old people. As I said before, children are a lifeblood of a nation. And we went back into the ghetto, my mother, my father, and me. And life went on, and from day to day. But I suppose my good nature, I realized that things were very bad. And I remember I took my most precious doll and I tore it into smithereens. I realized that things were very, very bad. That who knows what will happen tomorrow. I suppose I lost maybe my belief, but then life goes on. And we were taken back into the ghetto till July of 19, I can stay here for hours and tell you all kinds of horrible things, but I have to move on. July 1944, the Kaunas ghetto, I'm 10 years old. The Kaunas ghetto is being liquidated. They're telling us that they are taking us to a much better place. We're going to have better housing. We are loaded on cattle cars. And if you speak to any survivors, the cattle cars were worse than sardines. No water, no sanitation, and you are traveling all the way from Lithuania into Poland to get away of the oncoming Allies. And I don't remember how many days, 3 or 4 days, you see people around you, some who were older already, not breathing, but my father and my mother and I were still alive. And when we got to our destination, as I said, everything was so orchestrated. The cattle cars were opened up, and immediately all the men that were still alive were taken to one side. The women and all the other younger people, older than me, but younger, or some were yet a little bit younger, to one side. I have to tell you, this was the last time I saw my father. At that moment, you don't know. All the men were taken to Dachau. And there's in Toronto a few Lithuanian Jews, Eli Gotz, who was saved with his father at Dachau. My mother and I were taken to Stutthof, not Auschwitz. Auschwitz, I missed. And when we got to Stutthof, we saw women with their heads shaved in uniforms. We were told those were Hungarian Jews. 1944 was the crux of the Hungarian deportation. Some were taken to Auschwitz, and some were taken to Stutthof. And orders came out right away. Leave your clothes, they're going to be washed, and go and find new clothes, and then register. Because they had to know who is who. They were very meticulous in keeping accounts. And I remember my mother said to me, with fire in her eyes, "Whatever I do, do not say a word." And when we went to pick clothes, my mother picked clothes for me. I remember shoes with a little heel. I remember some unmentionables, and a skirt, a jacket, I don't remember, I think a brown jacket. And she stuffed me in the right places, and she said again, "Not a word." And when we went to register, but before that, sorry, I forgot a very important thing to tell you. before picking clothes, we were told to go and have a shower. We were given a bar of soap. I remember I was so excited to have a shower. But can you imagine the older people who understood that sometimes instead of water came out cyclone gas? I was very excited. And when she dressed me up, and as I said, stuffed me in the right places, looked at me again, do not say a word. And when we went to register, my mother looked them straight in the eye. She was very short, and I was taller. I was tall as my father. I looked presentable. She told them that I am 12 years old, that I am arbeitsfähig, which means I am a worker. And maybe God was really watching, and they believed. And we were sent into the camp, into the Stutthof concentration camp. And if the ghetto was bad, if a labor camp was bad, a concentration camp was a lot worse. We slept on bunks, one on top of each other. Lights were all around you. You were watched 24 hours, and the rations were still smaller. And I have to tell you that you meet other people who are there to help you. You have to understand. My mother, we were afraid in case somebody would notice when I washed up that I am not what I am, that I am still a kid. So there was always women that you meet in the camp that are not your friends, standing around to make sure that you're okay, that nobody notices, that you are not what you are. And life went on like this. And now I'm going to tell you a very important thing. I will not finish till I speak. I call them people who risk their lives for somebody else. Non-Jews, righteous among the nations. There were murderers, but there were also wonderful people. And in that Stutthof concentration camp, a righteous among the nations saved my life. What happened? One day, my mother notices I have a terribly high temperature. I'm burning up. And every concentration camp had a little infirmary where there was a nurse in charge. And she had to take me to the nurse. I was burning up. I couldn't climb on the bunks. I needed a bed. And that German nurse put me on a bed, wrapped my neck around because I had blotches all around my neck. And what did she do? She risked her life for me. Why? In those days, if you helped a Jew, there was no judge, there was no jury, you were shot. And if they knew of your family was shot. When the Nazi doctors came on rounds to see in the infirmary who is very sick, that has to be finished, and who is all right, that can go back into the camp. They never saw me. That nurse, head nurse, lifted me from bed to bed. She knew when they are coming because I had a communicable disease. A communicable disease in a concentration camp, I would have been taken out and shot immediately. And maybe God was watching. And I got better. With very little medicine, with very, very little food, less than before yet. And when I got better, every time you see the big chimney there, not as big as Auschwitz, but there was a chimney. There was also, to one side, we found that where there were burning bodies. So you try to leave. If you have a job, you leave the camp. You go into another job. And when there was any work detail, my mother and I, she pulled me, I was the first one in line. And I was taken to 3 small labor camps away out from the concentration camp. And it is recorded, Tunsen, Merzen, and Lubitsch, to dig trenches near the front. And now I'm going to brag. I was a terrific trench digger. I used to make a double portion of soup. I don't know. God was watching. I don't know. And we worked like this till the ground froze over. That was already the end of 44, the beginning of 45. And what should they do with us? You hear planes overhead, and it's called the Death March, because you are marching in the snow away from the oncoming Allies, the opposite direction. And I have to tell you, this was a blur. Snow and ice and cold. I don't remember, I only remember the cold, and I remember that my mother was always pushing me on. We were allowed to rest near a lean-to in a barn. And also, my mother talked about it afterwards, seeing some of the women that helped me fall to the ground, because if you fell, there was nobody to pick you up. This is why it was called the Death March. And we marched like this for days and days. I don't remember. I only remember cold, and I only remember being pushed on, my mother pushing me on. I don't think she ever hugged me in that time. The only thing was survival, not to fall to the ground and not to freeze. I don't remember. I only remember one day we saw a building, and my mother told my kids that I said it's a castle. It wasn't a castle. It was abandoned barracks. And we were allowed to go into that barrack for the first time in days. We slept over the night, and I think that time we felt it was the best hotel in town. And then one day, we noticed that the guards have left us. We were left all alone. The doors were locked, but we were left inside the barracks all alone. And I suppose some of the women tried to open those doors. Some had to crawl. And when we opened the door, we saw a man on a horse galloping towards us. I know we're not so good, best of friends with the Russians. I will never forget this Russian captain. He told us that he's a Russian captain, and the Russian army was right behind him. And he told us that we are free. You cannot imagine the scene that I saw. Some of the women couldn't even walk, crawled over, they pulled him down, they were hugging, they were kissing him. And I found little pieces of paper that my mother wrote, it's a good thing the army was behind him, or the women who could walk or crawl would kiss him to death. We were taken to the Russian zone. Some of the women had to be carried in. They were wonderful to us. I cannot say one word. And for me, a shower. I didn't have to masquerade. In 1945, I was still at 10 and a half years old. I was not a teenager. Clean clothes and everything else I could take off. I didn't have to worry. And some of the women had to be taken to the hospital. They took very good care. And I remember my mother walking to women and saying, I'm a medical person. Don't eat so fast after so many days without food. Some didn't listen, some listened. And we were in that Russian zone till May of 1945. The war is finished. And the biggest thing is to find out if you survived. Oh, my father, my mother's sisters, anybody, any relatives, anybody. And we were there, and then we were told we were already in Poland, that in the city of Lodz If we will get there, we'll be able to find out who survived. We were given permission. My mother spoke as perfect Russian, so we got permission, and we got to lodge. And I have to tell you, this was January 1924. January 1945. The 21st of January 1945. We got to lodge. And I cannot tell you what happened to me then. I found out that my father didn't want to live without us. My father, the strong person and everything, he was sure, he saw children my age being taken away, being killed. He did not want to live without us. And it was very ironic that when my father had to march out of Dachau, he disobeyed. He would not go. He was shot. January 22nd, 1945, we were liberated a couple of weeks later. What do? In my good nature, I did not want to live without my father. But I suppose you look around and you see how lucky I was. I had a mother. There were so many orphans. And life goes on. And we were taken to a DP camp, a displaced persons camp, people without a country in Austria, Bad Gastein. And you wait, you can't go anywhere. You have to have a sponsor that should sponsor you to travel, to come to Canada, to come to the United States, anywhere. It took 3 years. Here's my Lithuania. Oops. Here is March 1948. From 45 to 48, we were in the DP camp. And March of 1948, papers came out, because papers were made out for my uncle in South Africa, my aunt in New Rochelle, New York, and my uncle in Montreal. And my uncle said that we came on beer. He used to entertain any senator. It still took 3 years, March of 1948. He remembered that my mother gave him money to come to Canada. And this was a picture that somebody fixed my hair, somebody gave me a jacket. I should look presentable because we were examined by doctors. You couldn't just leave like this. You had to be perfectly healthy. March 1948. To start a new life. Montreal, Quebec. And I'm going to brag about my mother. Again, I hope she's listening. There's a very big hospital. It's called the Jewish General Hospital if you ever go to Montreal. It takes up a couple of blocks. And she went into that hospital and she says, she's a nurse. And they said, where are your papers? She says, you know, everything was taken away. Well, they wanted to be, my mother should be a nurse's aide. You know, bedpans, a nurse's aide? 1948, September of 1948. My mother was 35 and a half years old. My mother went back to McGill Nursing School. I wouldn't. Can you imagine with all the young girls? And this is a picture of my mother. And you can see she has a pin. In those days, there was nothing hanging. They put you a pin. She graduated and got her RN. In this picture, you can see nobody was happier in the whole wide world than my mother on that day, 1952. And for 25 years, at the Jewish General Hospital in pediatrics on the 5th floor, my mother ruled. And a lot of the interns were afraid of my mother. If she called them to come to see a child, they came. And with me, I have to tell you, teachers are wonderful people. I know if you marry a doctor, everybody makes a big thing. If you marry a doctor, everybody's also excited. But teachers are wonderful. What happened? My aunt lived in NDG. It wasn't a very Jewish district in those days. It wasn't Sunderban. And my aunt registered me Wellington Public School. I was a greenhorn. We were called greenhorns in those days. I spoke with an accent. I didn't look like everybody else. But that teacher spoke to the class. And the children were wonderful to me. Nobody made fun of me. Everybody helped me with my studies. I was very lucky. As I said, teachers were wonderful. And I went to school. And don't forget, I had to have French also. Quebec, Montreal, not only English, but French. The French teacher called me Françoise. And I studied day and night. During the week, you didn't go out. My mother, I didn't go out. Only on the weekends. And I went to school, and I graduated in accounting. I had a terrific job with LEP Transport Custom Brokers. And I was very lucky, I have to tell you. I found the most wonderful man. Although he was a Polish Jew, my mother wasn't very excited about it in the beginning. He wasn't a Lithuanian Jew. The Lithuanian Jews and the German Jews held themselves a little bit higher than the Polish Jews. But as you can see, the bridegroom was better looking than the bride. And I had 4 children, 3 sons and a daughter. And I had a terrific job. And how come I became a junior kindergarten teacher? I went one day to volunteer in my kids' school, the United Talmud Torah in Montreal. And one of the teachers said, "What do you do?" I say, "I have 4 kids. My mother works at the hospital. I have no sisters or brothers. I go to the office, bring back books, write them up at home, and then go back to the office." She says, "You're a natural. Go back to teach." Sir George gives credit for ECE. And as I said, I was married to a wonderful person. And we worked together, and I started to teach in Montreal. And why am I here? 1970s. Pierre Laporte was killed by the FLQ. A turmoil in Montreal. A lot of Jews were afraid and decided to move, some to Ottawa, a lot to Toronto. Toronto got an influx. We used to say, we made Toronto what it is. And in 1972, we moved to Toronto. And I was very lucky that one of the schools, Bialik, gave me a chance for 2 years because everybody said, you know how it is, you come from another province, it's not enough, our credentials are higher, yours are lower. I was given a chance, and then for 26 years, I was at Associated Hebrew School. I am Mora Fegi, the best time of my life. My mother wasn't as thrilled because afterwards, my mother found a wonderful gentleman in Montreal. He was from Bessarabia. His parents sent him to Montreal to study. He was an art teacher at the École des Beaux-Arts. They met in Montreal. A wonderful man. I loved my stepfather. My daughter has 1 child. My daughter named her child after my stepfather. So they moved afterwards, and we moved to Toronto. And I got a job at Associated, as I said, and it was the best time of my life. I think my mother was a little bit disappointed I didn't go into medicine, but yeah, you know. But I am still Mora Fegi. And now, as I said, I go from school to school. We have to teach children. And I'm so thrilled that I saw young people dance here. Young people were dancing here. Do you know what that is? That is more important than anything else. You sang Hebrew songs. You feel what we went through. This is my second time coming here. I am honored to be here with you. And maybe they will learn. They will be the ambassadors, and it will not happen what happened last week when 11 people were killed for nothing. So as I said, I go from school to school, and I'm very fortunate. This is when my mother had moved already to Montreal at Baycrest. People found out that my mother survived and that she got a testimonial luncheon for saving lives during the war. And here, as I said, you can see me from school to school. I belong to the Holocaust Center, the Simon Wiesenthal Center, and the Dominion Institute with all the veterans. As long as I remember what I'm saying, I'm going to go. And now, this is my, as I said, I have 4 children. I have 11 great-grandchildren, and I have great-grandchildren all over. But I am not going to leave you. These are my great-grandchildren. And I'm not going to leave you till I have to speak about my passion. Righteous among the nations. People who risk their lives for somebody else. In those days, if you helped a Jew, you were shot. If they found out of your family was shot. And my very first one that I will always remember is Mr. Sugihara. Who was Mr. Sugihara? The war, as I told you, didn't start in Lithuania. In 1940, there was no war. He came in as an ambassador from Japan. He had a terrific office. He had everything. What did Mr. Sugihara do? He saw Polish Jews coming into Lithuania, having no place where to go. He sat in his office and he made out visas. His government was very upset with him. That was a no-no. He was taken back to Japan. He lost everything. He became a pauper, a light bulb salesman. But Mr. Sugihara will always have a place in Jerusalem. He will be always remembered. He saved over 6,000 Jews. Can you imagine? He lost everything. Irina Sandler. Who was Irina Sandler? A Catholic lady who lived in Warsaw, right near the ghetto. Irina Sandler devised a plan to save Jewish children from the ghetto. She was a nurse, so she had a chance to go into the ghetto. And with help of some of the underground people, in burlaps, in sacks, through the underground, she saved 2,500 Jewish children. She wrote their names and buried the names in glasses so the parents would find it afterwards. She risked her life for other human beings. She had a dog, that the dog would bark if a soldier would come near her. Somebody squealed. You made money if you squealed on a Jew. She was arrested. She was beaten. She didn't divulge who helped her. She was left for dead, but she was saved. And she lived at the ripe old age of 98. And it's very interesting. There was a gathering in Toronto a few years back. And I met a woman, and she said she can only stay for a couple of days because she looks after Irina. Irina's husband had passed away, and she's looking after her. Irena Sandler saved her as a newborn in a toolbox. Nicholas Winton, an Englishman that arranged transport. He came to Czechoslovakia for children, Jewish children. And right over here is Mr. Perlaska, right there. And Mr. Perlaska came to Hungary. And he also said he's an ambassador. And he also bought some homes. And in fact, Mary Ziegler, who's one of the heads at the Holocaust Center, her grandparents and her aunt were saved by Mr. Perlaska. And over there on top is an Italian gentleman, a young man, Gino Bertoli. Who was Gino Bertoli? Gino Bertoli had a bicycle and he won the Tour de France. So he was a big shot. What did he do? He used to lift his seat of the bicycle, and he was given in Italy papers, Aryan papers, to give to Jews that they can save themselves. And I do a lot of homework. And I have to tell you that I don't have him. I'm sorry, I don't have him on me yet. I have to augment my list. Over there is Colonel from El Salvador, Colonel Costellanos. And my new one is Manuel Quizon. Manuel Quizon was the prime minister in the Philippines. Can you imagine? He saved 1,200 Jews after Kristallnacht, when a lot of Jews tried to run away and they didn't have anywhere to go. Can you imagine? He was a prime minister. He had to bother with Jews. I have to put a picture of him on there too. Oh, definitely. So you see, there were wonderful people. People who were not killers. And I have one more that I met face to face. Her name is Czeslava Zak. I traveled in 2009, 10, and 11 with March of Remembrance and Hope with a gentleman named Pinchas Gutter, with university students to Poland and to Germany to show them exactly what happened. And somebody said that they have a surprise for me because everybody knew how I was. And they introduced me to Czeslava Zak. And she told us that she lived also in Warsaw and that her family decided to help out. What did they do? She had a house, and in her bedroom, there was a cupboard. And every time she had families hiding in the cupboard. She says, one day, what happened? One of the neighbors saw something was not, as we say, not kosher. Something was happening. And the Gestapo broke in early in the morning into her house. And they wanted to go into the cupboard. And she said, I told them they can't come in to open the cupboard because I'm raising rabbits. If you open the door, all the rabbits, in Polish, rabbits are króliki. The rabbits will come out. And she said, I fainted. I don't know if she fainted on purpose or fainted. And they had pity on her. It's all relative how things happen. And she said at that moment, a family of 5 were hiding in the cupboard. And she told me that she went to Israel and to meet that family, the grandmother and a little girl, she says, maybe 2 or 3 years old, came with a bouquet of flowers and said, thank you for giving me life. You see how life is, how things are. If you have goodness in your heart, if you help, and if you work and if you see how wonderful other people can be. And I'm going to show you one more thing before I leave you. As I said, I belong to the Holocaust Center and the Simon Wiesenthal Center. And in 2007, I spoke at the Simon Wiesenthal Center. And there was a lady, a young woman, who is the director. Her name is Melissa Mikkel. She's not Jewish. She's fantastic. She went home and told her story to her mother, to her parents. Her mother used to make her every year, her mother's an artist, used to make her every year an old-fashioned doll for her birthday. She told her mother her story, and in 2008, Melissa called me up and said she wants to see me, and I was excited. The director wanted to see me. And she brought me a present that I don't know who's going to get it when I'm gone. I'm not going anywhere yet, but her mother found a head while she was buying the other heads to make her the old-fashioned dolls, a genuine Shirley Temple doll. Mrs. Mikkel never met me. She met me afterwards. I went to say thank you. With this white and red dress, and it says in the back, "Dear Faggy, love lives here." This is my most prized possession. It's standing. I am very lucky. My husband passed away from mesothelioma. That's cancer of the cavity of the lung. It's incurable. This is a horrible disease. He lived for 5 years. And I was very fortunate that after I have 3 sons and a daughter, that my son-in-law, you know, there was a program, who would you not live with? And all the men said mother-in-laws. And I'm very lucky that my son-in-law invited me to live with them. I live in Thornhill on a very nice street on Arnold Avenue. And this stands in my sitting room. I don't know who's going to get this. I don't know who's going to inherit my doll. I haven't made up my mind yet. This is my most prized possession. When I feel blue sometimes without Benny, and Lily met Benny. He was one of the nicest people. I lost a husband who was one of the nicest people. He was B'nai B'rith, Man of the Year Award, twice, Humanitarian Award. He used to work with cerebral palsy kids. He used to take all the children in the wheelchairs on the island. And to this day, he was one of a kind. He's mourned by everybody who knew him. So, and I look at the doll and I say, people are still wonderful. And we have to remember, and especially the young people, to be nice to each other. There is beauty and goodness in every one of us. We don't all look alike. That's a good thing. It would be very boring. But we're all wonderful. And as long as I can, I will go around, and especially now, my friends say, didn't you have enough? No, especially what happened. Hatred is a horrible thing. And I'm going to sing you a song that I sing at school. We have to finish up with the song. That people should remember. Love is something, if you give it away, give it away, give it away. Oh, love is something, if you give it away, you end up having more. Love is like a magic penny. You hold on tight and you won't get any. Lend it, spend it, you'll have so many. They'll roll right on the floor. Love is something, if you give it away, give it away, give it away. Oh, love is something, if you give it away, you end up having more. And I hope love will be with all of you forever. Thank you very much for listening. Very surely. Thank you very, 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 very much. Take care, and you keep up your wonderful work. Keep up, spread the love, and spread the songs. I tell you, I didn't know how, when I heard you singing and dancing all those Hebrew songs, I think I grew, I grew 10 feet tall. I grew taller.
Yeah.
Thank you so very much.
Wow. Okay, picture.
Thank you for coming.
And let's spread love.
Yeah.
And
Well,
let's-
that's the message for tonight. See, love is something if you give it away. See, a lot of people say that I love you, but it's just in their heart. Give it away. Act it out. Like if you want to help, then actually help. And thank God for
and
the
be
help.
nice to each other. Some
Yeah.
of us are better looking, some of us are older. I'm getting older. I try not to think about it, but what can you do?
And of course, we always want to spread this message around. And it's done through the Newburger Holocaust, how do you call it?
Center.
Center. And every year, we always want to put in a seed into that center.
Yes.
And so this time, again, let's give something. See, it's just a seed. It's not a lot of money that we give, but it's a seed to keep this center going.
And one of the directors is my granddaughter.
Oh, see. Okay. So why don't we...
She's a little director. She's a little one.
See, ignorance, friends, ignorance. Even the Bible tells us
Yes.
that because of ignorance, God's people perish.
Yes.
So if we are educated enough, then we will avoid the occurrence again of this. So if we know, friends, how life is so valuable, then we should be able to keep life, save others. And for Manuel, we pronounce it Quezon, but it can be done Quezon.
Quezon.
Yeah, but it's Quezon.
Yeah.
And he was the president of the Philippines.
Oh, yes.
So, you know, I'm just blessed with Israel because they have a memorial in Tel Aviv.
Yes. In Jerusalem.
No, in Tel Aviv.
In Tel Aviv, yeah.
There is a park there with a memorial, and they call it an open door. And it's a big and huge memorial for our president. And so again, it was a good time, a good like a show of love for us
Yes.
too, Filipinos.
Oh, yes. He's going on my list, on my board again. You know what I mean?
Okay.
He has to go on.
Yeah. Okay, so meantime, thank you so much for sharing your story. It's very encouraging. I just can't imagine myself at your age being able to survive everything. You know, the Lord was actually watching
100%.
over you.
Somebody was watching over me. My mother and somebody and the gentleman up there.
Yeah. That's it, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and
Yeah.
Jacob
Yeah.
watching over you.
Watching over me.
Yeah.
Because I happen to be one of the youngest to make it. You know what I mean? There were some hidden children who are younger than me.
Yeah.
But those who went through everything, I'm one of the youngest.
So it's
So
really
it's,
a miracle.
It is a miracle. I am a miracle. That's
Yeah,
why I
yeah.
smile a lot. I smile a lot.
Yes, very good. Okay, so if you're ready, please bring your offering here,
Yes.
and I'll pray for Fagi, and then we'll pray for again those that are grieving even tonight.
I need an envelope. I want an envelope. I need an envelope.
Can I have envelope too?
I want an
No?
envelope.
Yeah, yes. Okay, stay here. And then you don't go. We have dinner tonight. more dances before we go for dinner. You know, we prepared for a lot of people, so we have a lot of food. Okay? If you are a kosher, we have kosher food tonight. Yes. We get a lot. Let me tell you, when I say a lot, it's a lot. Okay, so we'll have food after. Okay, for the non-kosher, we can go down, and then there's another room out there for the kosher food.
Show you, I have already your president. I have him in my, and I did a lot of homework about him. Here he is, and there's a whole to-do. See, all about him.